So, the first thing about painting fabric, and I always have to say this no matter what you're painting, and the general rules about oil painting are the same. It doesn't matter whether you're painting fabric or trees or somebody's face. You're putting in values, you're leaving them alone, you're not blending, you're doing all the same rules that I teach in all my videos. Um, Furthermore, in this video, I did pre-mix some basic colors, as you can see. Um, when you see the palette, you'll see my colors laid out. But in general, I'm not doing all the color checking that I would expect somebody who I was teaching or who was doing my method for the first time. I would expect for them to do a lot more color checking, to go a lot slower, and to basically follow my method um, as it's laid out in the 3 videos on my site: how to paint in oil, how to draw in proportion, and how to mix colors from life. And those videos are all YouTube videos that are free to watch, but you can find them on drawmixpaint.com, and all 3 of those videos are highlighted. So that's my core method, and I always want to make sure that you understand that this is a little bit more me just going for it, just doing my thing. I'm not checking colors like I expect my students to do. And if you don't know what color checking is all about, you can go watch some of my other videos where I explain how to do that. In general, if you're working from life, you can use a color checker, which you can make for yourself. And I have a video that explains that. Or you can work from a photograph, and in that case, you can put your little spots of color right on a laminated photograph to check color. So, but as I lay in these colors, as you can see, I'm starting with the darks, putting in my very darkest colors first, and then going and putting in the next lightest color, etc., and just kind of moving from black up into the lights. I always paint dark to light. There's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, it's much, much easier to put a light color on top of a dark color rather than vice versa. So I'm just laying in these dark colors. I didn't do any penciling on this. I'm just kind of penciling, you know, just free form. I'm just doing my thing. The penciling isn't really too complicated on this. But again, if you want to see how to pencil and how to learn to pencil, go watch my video, How to Draw in Proportion. Because in this video, I'm not doing any drawing. Well, I'm drawing, but I'm drawing with the brush. So just always modifying my colors, as you can see. So I'm shifting it toward the yellow or toward the green because I see some color shift in the fabric. So I can take the original fabric colors that I mixed and just modify them. And you'll see me doing that over and over and over again. It doesn't matter what I'm painting. So, and that's just because I saw some of that color in there. So you'll notice that I do some blending when I paint, but it's not, I always leave the texture in. And you'll notice that even in the way I move my brush, I am very careful not to soften everything up where you lose the texture or whether you lose the surface. And that goes for anything. It doesn't matter if you're painting fabric that's as smooth as it can be. As you lay in your values, you lay them down and you do not blend. And this is my method. There are other people that would tell you to do otherwise. But I really feel it's important to lay down all your values, all your colors, you know, just almost like patchwork. Just lay them in, and then once you've got your canvas covered, then you can blend and play. But before then, it's best just to focus on getting your values right. And you can see how much time I spend on the palette. And you know, I didn't even show you guys in this video all the time that I spend on the palette, not even close. But I do show a few times like this. This is the kind of thing I'm always doing, always playing with my color. You know, especially true with faces, but in fabric where you have all these reflections, you can look into that source picture that I'm working on and see the purples or the pinkish colors as they reflect off the table in the shadow. So I just mix some general fabric colors and then I modify them as I go. So again, really checking your values. If you're doing this and you want to paint fabric, you absolutely need to learn to see your values. And the best way to do that is through color checking. It's not something that you'll do for the rest of your life as an artist. I certainly don't. And in fact, I encourage my students to leave color checking behind. But as a way to learn and as a way to see values, there's no better way. So if you were painting this fabric and you didn't have the experience I had, I would highly recommend that you do a lot of color checking, putting little spots on your photo or whatever it is. There's no better way to learn to see value quickly. So, as you notice, I'm laying in these colors, I'm not blending, I'm leaving them alone, and I'm painting what I refer to as painting ugly, meaning that up close, when you're sitting in your chair, and this is real important, especially for something like fabric, where even like really smooth fabric with smooth transitions and everything, you do not go in and start blending. You just lay in your patchwork of color, leave it alone, and then once all the canvas is covered, you can go in and do some blending. But it's best to leave that till the end. And you'll notice, you'll see me blend like right here as I drag my brush across that division line. Because I'm working wet and wet, in fact, one of the nice things about working wet and wet is you get a lot of natural blending. You get a lot of colors mixing into each other because you're painting wet into wet. And that's a great thing. So here I'm putting in some purples. As you can see, the reds, the red shift. And I did not, the photograph that I've put up here on the screen for your benefit so you can see what I'm working from is not a perfect reproduction of what I was looking at. The colors are a little different in the photo than they were in the source that I was looking at. And so therefore, you'll notice there are some slight differences in how I lay in the colors. But in general, you'll see the color shifts, and you'll see how I deal with them. I'm not laying in my darks in perfect order. I try to work dark to light, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that I'm not following that rule to the letter. I'm jumping around a little bit as I go. But it's really something that you should avoid as much as you can, because if you put in your values in order, meaning from dark to light, you will begin to see your subject just like you can now. You can look at the fabric and you can compare my painting easily, the shapes and the lines and everything, to the source. And the reason you can do that is because I've laid in my darks in order. If I had jumped all around and put in the lights and put in some darks here and there and it was just all over the place, you would not be able to see this fabric develop in a three-dimensional way the way that you can now. And that's especially true for portraits, where you're trying to keep a likeness. And it's just easier to work dark to light. I've found I couldn't work any other way. I mean, if you have a light color and you're trying to blend a dark color into it, you get a lot of milk. But if you go the other way around, you get a lot less milk. It's just easier. So as you can see, I'm really kind of taking it almost too far with that yellow and the green. I've definitely exaggerated it from the source. And I probably did that knowing that I'm going to come back in with some of that reddish purple shift color and bump into it. and take some of that down. But you know, in the end, I think I did separate my color a little more than was in the source photo. So avoiding the lights until the very end. The other nice thing about doing that is it keeps you from milking up your shadows. You know, it's almost like you really want to hold off. So in terms of as far as painting fabric goes and what's unique about fabric, you know, to anything else, and there's not a lot, you know, painting is painting, and I always have to remind my students about that in my private workshops, that it's not, um, you know, painting is laying color down, uh, putting in your values, and it doesn't matter what you're painting. What happens with fabric is you get a lot of reflection. You get a lot of reflection as the fabric folds reflect upon themselves. You get these unusual shifts in color that are so wonderful. You can see, you know, light fabrics, especially white fabrics, creamy fabrics like this one. You can see the shifts in the color a lot more. Where, for instance, the purples and the yellows, and I've kind of exaggerated that, as you can see. But I think I may bring that down a little bit as I work. It's very tempting to put in your lights. It's very tempting to just go in and start putting in the highlights, because they're a lot of times they help define what you're looking at. But I try to avoid putting in my lights until the very end. Now I've put them in over on the left there, as you can see, and as again, I'm not following my rules perfectly. I'm painting little sections at a time. For this video, it worked out better if I painted the left half and then the right half, so that I could put up a nice source photo for you to look at. Now here I'm correcting my penciling, which I don't know what I did, but I got that wrong. But I'm going to paint the left half of this fabric painting, and then I'm going to finish the right half, which didn't have quite as much detail in it. A lot of times, I've seen comments where people ask me, you know, why is if you look at my brush, it sort of hesitates, it jiggles around, it jumps all over the place. Some of that is me sort of trying to paint with an abstract stroke. But a lot of times what's happening is I'm looking at the source, and I'm trying to figure out what I should do, and so my brush jumps around while I'm doing that. So I don't know if that's been confusing to anybody, but I have seen a few comments asking why my brush jiggles around so much. And this video is about, I think it's about 40 something minutes long. And the painting itself, I think, took me about 4 full hours to paint. So I've reduced 4 hours down to about 40 something minutes. Now, a lot of that is just me wiping my brushes on paper towels, or, you know, glancing down at my phone to check an email or whatever it is. But in general, that's mostly when the cameras are running, I'm busy usually. So about 4 hours to paint this. Now, if you were painting with my method for the first time, I would expect for you to take a week. But then as you paint and as you learn the method, and you start to get it and you start to see, the speed will come very quickly. You know, by the third painting, you're painting twice as fast as you did on your first one. And then after about 6 months, you really speed up a lot. This is actually a very quick method for painting. I mean, I don't know. I suppose there are people that could paint this faster than 4 hours, but in general, to do realism like this, that's pretty quick. A lot of that is just, wet and wet, laying your colors down, getting them right the first time. And those are all good habits that I've learned from my early days of color checking. And, when I used to do portraits, I always would sit down with my clients and do all this color mixing and color checking with my brush. But I just can't recommend it enough for learning to see values. So the fold line there, the dark line that I'm painting around, um, whenever you see a line like that, and if you look over there on the source photo, the tendency is to paint those sorts of lines much darker than they really are. So that goes back to my number one, what's the difference question that doesn't get asked. So in other words, when you're looking at your source and your painting and you're asking yourself, what's the difference between the two? And you're trying to make your painting look more like the source, the number one question that doesn't get asked is which is more subtle. So in other words, if I see a reflection line on the fabric, mine should not stand out any more than it does in the source. And that shadow line, the crease line in the fabric there should not stand out any more in my painting than it does in the source. So in my private classes, I tell all my students, or I try to tell all of them, that they should get an index card and write which is more subtle on it and stick it to their studio wall, because it's the one question that people forget. They'll get everything right about their painting, but then they've exaggerated something. So if you see those little, folds and what I'm working on, the texture there in the fabric, those little lines that you see in the source, they should be just as subtle when I paint them. And it's so easy to exaggerate things. So easy. So after you put in your color, and you've covered your canvas and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your painting, never forget to ask which is more subtle. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be a glow in a teapot. It can be a reflection, in this case, on the fabric, in the shadow, whatever it is. It's one of the things that I think separates the very best realism from very good realism, is that ability to paint with a subtle, where there's all this subtlety, where a line on somebody's forehead, a wrinkle on a forehead is not exaggerated in your painting. All these little creases in the fabric should not be exaggerated. They should not stand out more in my fabric than they do in the source. And the biggest part of that is, first of all, getting your values right. So if you're checking your colors, don't just assume a line is a dark line. Go and check it and find out exactly what it is, because things tend to be, you see a dark line and you think it's a lot darker than it is. So, as you see, as I'm painting, I am doing some blending, and I think that it's not, the worst thing in the world you can do if you know what you're doing and you're not polluting your shadows. Then you can sort of blend as you go. But what I tell my students, and this is absolutely critical, is I will, when people take my private class, I will not let them blend. Now they do, and I'll stop them, and they'll they may have bad habits or whatever, but I always will point out that they're over blending. I say, first you lay in your colors, you cover your canvas, you do not blend, you do not play, you do not fix. You cover your canvas and you move on. And then once the canvas is covered, then you are in a much better, you have a much better ability to see what's wrong with it because all your values are put in. So I've basically finished that left side of the painting there, and I'm just laying in some more color, you know, getting in the lights very carefully. A lot of the way that my brush dances around is trying to maintain an abstract stroke. Now that's something that I've developed over years. There's a lot of different ways you can stroke your brush, and there's no right or wrong. I know great artists that jab their brushes. I know great artists that pull their brushes. You know, there's every kind of brushstroke under the sun, and I don't believe there's any right or wrong about what type of stroke that you have. But what I will say is that I have noticed in all grade abstraction, it's my strong opinion that you must maintain an abstract brushstroke or an abstract pattern when you're painting in a pattern like I'm doing now in this fabric. It has to be abstract, and what I mean is it can't be regular. What people tend to do as they paint is they tend to put in a stronger pattern than is really there, or they make the pattern more regular. So they paint stroke, 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 and all of a sudden there's 3 lines in a row. So it's sort of keeping that abstraction. It's the same abstraction you see in nature. You know, if you look at a rock or a pile of leaves or anything really in nature, you can see patterns just like you can see patterns in leaves and trees, but there's an abstraction to it. And that is something that, you know, I need to make a whole video. I've made videos where I talk a lot about it, but I need to really demonstrate what that means. But if you look at my brushwork, you'll notice there's a sort of a messiness to it that's hard to define. And that's really important. It's something that, you know, in something like this, I'm trying to keep it as abstract as I see it. So if you look at the source and you see that pattern of little shadow lines and everything else, you know, there's really not a regular pattern to it. It's sort of just a mixture of shapes. This canvas stain that I work on, and these are Geneva paints that I'm using, and this is Geneva canvas stain, but I really like the color for a lot of reasons. It's a great neutral color. It's also great for if it pokes through, like you can see the canvas stain coming through in certain parts where I don't, and I'm sure that you could go up to my finished painting and find little bits of bare canvas poking through here and there. But it's wonderful the way it works with almost all colors, especially neutral colors like this. I mean, it would be so much harder to paint this on a white canvas. This makes it so much easier. And these paints, the Geneva paints that I'm using, you know, we manufacture them right here in Austin, Texas, GenevaFineArts.com. But they already have the medium mixed into them. So I've seen comments where people are asking me, how do I get my paint so fluid? Well, this Geneva paint has medium already mixed into it, so I just squirt it out and it's ready to go. I don't have to mix, you know, anything else into it to thin it down like you do with normal paint. And the other nice thing about this paint is it doesn't have any harmful fumes. So there's no solvents in it, there's no mineral spirits, there's no turpentine or anything like that. And that makes it really nice because you can use it without any risk of toxic fumes. So just finally laying in the highlights, which is always a lot of fun to do. You know, you hold off for so long, and then putting in the highlights is what typically sets everything off. And even when I'm putting in these highlights, you'll notice I kind of put it in with a little bit of abstraction. I don't just draw a white line, I kind of lay it in a an abstract way. Fabric especially is something where you can't exaggerate your lines. If I go back and look at my very first paintings where I painted fabric, that was the thing I did over and over is I exaggerated every crease. Every crease was darker, every fold had a darker shadow, and I just exaggerated everything. It took me a while to figure that out. But especially in fabric, I mean, you can paint a whole painting, and then when it comes down to fabric, it's fabric and hands. People tend to exaggerate the shadow lines. On hands, they tend to make the shadows between the fingers darker, and they tend to exaggerate the wrinkles and the veins and everything else that you see in hands. And fabric's the same way. People tend to make the shadow lines darker and delineate everything more, define everything more, and it's all about that subtlety. I wanted to tell you that red color that you see there in the video, for some reason my camera makes our red color look a lot lighter than it really is. And we've had questions in the past about if you buy the Geneva red paint, it looks darker, quite a bit darker in real life than it does in these videos. And that's because for some reason my camera will take that intense red color and lighten it and increase the value and make it a little bit lighter than it really is. One of the nice things I like about bristle brushes, and you see me doing it there, is that because there's a little bit of stiffness to the brush, you can almost use the brush to steady your hand. You can let the tips of the bristles rest on the canvas and sort of help steady your hand as you're drawing a line. See how subtle those little reflections are? It's so easy to just make that way brighter than it should be. Even when you're painting reflections, you're holding off, you're waiting till the very end to put it in those lightest lights. I mean, as you can see, I've basically done with that part of the fabric, and now I'm finally putting in the crispy lights, and that's the only time, in my opinion, to do it. There's no point putting in those lights early. See, that color is probably a lot lighter than you might think it is. And that's just, the more you use color checking, as you're learning, the more you start to be able to see these values and these colors for yourself. You stop being surprised. The first time you start color checking and you check a color, you're always surprised. I mean, that's my students who don't have a lot of experience with my method that come and take my private class. They, I hear the comment over and over again. It's like, oh, I can't believe, how dark this is or how light this is, depending on, what they're painting and what the particular optical illusion that's going on in their painting is. And it's happening all the time. I mean, every time you see a dark color next to a light color, there's an optical illusion that's fooling you and telling you that you're seeing something you're not. But the more color checking you do, the less surprised you are. The more you put a color up, and in the beginning, you're always surprised, but after you've painted 20 still lifes, you're not surprised anymore. In fact, that's when you start to be able to see the color for yourself. Where you can, an artist who can look at look at some fabric, look into the shadow, mix that color up on their palette first shot, and get it right. That is a wonderful skill to have. And anybody can develop that skill, but you've got to do some color checking to start with. I mean, there are other ways certainly to do it, just from experience and, trial and error and everything else. But the color checking is just it just cuts right to it and teaches you very quickly to see values. So there's a little bit of blending, as you can see. So I do blend, but if you look at the blending that I do, I always leave the surface in there. You don't want to soften it up where it loses the texture. You always got to have the texture. I think there's, maybe if you're painting an egg and you're going for really high realism, that might be a time when you would, maybe not paint with texture. But even then, if you get right up to the egg, it's better if there's some very slight texture. And that goes obviously for cloth as well. So the lines on the table, which you can't see in this source photo, but they're very subtle. They're very, very subtle. You can almost hardly see them. And that, again, it goes back to that painting subtle, not exaggerating things. In my class, there's, where my students paint these still lifes. That's the first thing that they learn is painting this subtle, because if if you were painting this table, for instance, in those little very, very delicate lines that you see, those lines are so easy to exaggerate. So now working on the remaining half of the painting. I'm just laying in my colors. I just painted that black. I think there was some black fabric behind there, but I just painted it black. Painting on a stained canvas makes all the difference for being able to see your values. If I was painting that gray on a white canvas, it would look like one step from black, and I'm not kidding. It's like literally makes a huge difference. So one of the nice things about painting on this neutral stain color is that you see your darks as dark and you see your lights as light, meaning that the colors that are lighter than the stain stand out as a light color. And I mean, can you imagine, if you painted even a color that was slightly off from white on a white canvas, it'll look like a dark color, even though it's maybe a very bright color, only one step or two steps from white. So it's much easier to see your values, in my opinion, on a stained canvas rather than working on a white canvas. You can see what a mess my palette has become. There's, I think, a lot more yellow in the source that I was looking at rather than this photo. that I've got pasted up here. See, this is where working wet and wet is so nice, because as you can see, I'm putting in little bits of color, but because it's going into that wet paint, it kind of dissolves into it nicely. So I'm not blending, but it has a nice blending effect as you lay color in. It's very natural to blend, you know, as you lay in color. I just you know, advise against intentionally going in and smoothing things and playing with things and trying to change shapes and everything else by blending, because you end up with a big soft blur that really takes away. You've just got to have texture everywhere. You have to have a surface that the viewer can look at. And if you blend it up to super soft nothing, they can't look at it. They can't see the surface. And for some reason, we like to see the surface. So there, I'm breaking my rule. I'm putting in the lights before I should. Don't ask me why I did that. I really don't know why I decided to lay in that color. I think maybe I wanted to know where that reflection line was. And I'll be very careful when I do lay in those shadows. But it really never hurts. In fact, I really do advise my students to work dark to light across the whole painting. In this case, those shadow colors, or rather the stain color, is sort of a nice shadow color. So that's why I'm able to go ahead and kind of start seeing the fabric and visualize it. So big messy palettes are great. It means you have more color to choose from. So just a little bit of color right on that edge. I don't know what I was saying. It's hard to see it in the source, but I was obviously thinking it needed a little more cream in there in that reflection. And again, I think it's because my source was looked a little different to my eye than this photo does here that I've put in. So I guess that's what you would call the blending. You know, that if you want to call this blending, what I'm doing is I'm working into that shadow. You'll notice I do get a little bit of blending, but also notice how I keep some texture. It's very careful. It's part of the way, part of the reason my brush is jumping around the way it is because I'm being absolutely sure to keep a little bit of texture in there where I can see the surface. The other thing you'll notice is that I've painted this whole thing with large brushes. I don't think I ever used a very small brush at all, and certainly not any detail brushes. I generally try to advise my students to paint with as big a brush as they can stand. You tend to paint your values and focus on the big picture instead of the details when you use a larger brush. And also, it's easier to maintain the abstraction because with a big brush you can kind of roll it around and you're dragging and you're creating all these little odd shapes. the smaller your brush gets, the more you're painting lines. And you're painting in lines, and you're not painting in, shapes and colors. So let me just talk about fabric and what makes fabric unique, and that is really nothing to us. It's no different. The rules that and the method that I teach applies to fabric just as well as it does to a rock or to somebody's face, for that matter. Same same method, same way you paint, and everything else. What I will say, and that's possibly unique about fabrics, is just how important it is and how easy it is to exaggerate your lines and your folds and everything else. So when you're done with your fabric and you step back across the room, your folds should not be any more defined, and they shouldn't stand out more. The creases shouldn't be darker, everything else. So if anything, I've exaggerated it less. In other words, if you look at the little creases in the shadow in the top right up there, mine are a little bit more subtle. And so it wouldn't have hurt for me to go in and actually make them a little more defined. I certainly don't recommend painting softer or less defined than your source. It's just far more common for artists, especially amateurs and people who are starting out, to exaggerate things. But if you look into the shadow in the fabric, you'll notice that I did not exaggerate anything at all. And I may have even made it a little bit less exaggerated, and maybe I should have defined it a little more. Going back in and putting in my crispy blacks, it's always a good habit. It's always, it's so easy. When you finish a painting, take a look at all your blacks, and if you need to go back in and put in some what I call crispy blacks or black blacks, then it's a good idea to always remember to do that at the end of your, whenever you're painting an object and you calling it done. Look at your blacks again, pick up a clean brush, and paint your blacks back in. So there we go. There's the finished painting. Thank you guys for watching.